Hey everybody, in this video we're going to go through how we come up with the shape of the cosine graph. Now notice that we start with the unit circle because the basis of the cosine function is the idea of how do we find cosine of any angle through a given point. The key thing with the unit circle are these coordinates. That's the key thing. The labels are just helpful aids for us. And so if we think back to the video, we talked about how do we find sine or cosine for an angle given a point. What we said was cosine of x equals the x value divided by the distance from the origin. And the advantage we have here is that if we think about the unit circle, what's its radius? Well, if you look at any point on the axes, distance is all 1. And the unique thing about a circle is all the points are all the same distance away. And so for any point, regardless of whether they're on the axis or not, they're all a distance of 1. And so that simplifies this ratio here. And that means that cosine of x equals the x value of whatever the point is. So if I want to figure out the cosine of angle at 0, I just look at the x value and see that it's 1. So down here on my graph, I'm just going to say, all right, well, 0, that's my angle. And notice that that's how our x-axis is labeled. It's labeled for angles. And so we plot at 1. And so our next point is at pi over 6. So if we look at the x value, that's square root of 3 over 2. Well, it's not 1, it's less than that, and it's greater than a half. It's about 0.86 or so it's going to be somewhere about there. The next point is at pi over 3. And so if we look at pi over 3, we get an x value of 1/2. And then if we look at pi over 2, we get an x value of 0. And so here's what the first part of our cosine function looks like. So our next three angles are 2 pi over 3, 5 pi over 6, and pi. And they're over here in the second quadrant. 2 pi over 3, the x value is negative 1/2. At 5 pi over 6, the x value is negative radical 3 over 2. Notice that they're the same as the angles we just used before. They're just opposite. And then finally at pi, we have an x value of negative 1. And so now here's what this part of our graph looks like. So our next three angles are 7 pi over 6, 4 pi over 3, and 3 pi over 2. So over here we have 7 pi over 6, 4 pi over 3, and 3 pi over 2. And notice we're basically just retracing the same steps. And so oftentimes when you draw the graph of sine or cosine, you're going to end up using the same numbers over again. And so if I just retrace my steps backwards, it's going to be this point first, and then this point right there, and then at 3 pi over 2, we're back to 0. And so for our final set of angles, we have 5 pi over 3, 11 pi over 6, and 0. And we go from 1/2 to radical 3 over 2 to 1. And so down here, that's going to look like this. At 5 pi over 3, it's at 1/2. 11 pi over 6, it's 0.86 or so. And then at 2 pi, we have 1 again. And so here is what our cosine graph looks like from 0 to 2 pi. Now, notice that it doesn't stop, though. Notice that we have this extra angle, 13 pi over 6. How do we figure that out? Because 13 pi over 6 doesn't show up on the unit circle. So what are we supposed to do? Well, if you look at the increments, all these increments on the x-axis are pi over 6 units apart. So this is just pi over 6 units past 2 pi. So if 2 pi is right here, then pi over 6 units past that is right here. And so this, even though it says pi over 6, it's the same as 13 pi over 6. They're coterminal. They're pointing in the same direction. It's just 13 pi over 6 has an extra rotation added onto it. And so at that point, it's at radical 3 over 2. Now over here, we also have negative pi over 6 and negative pi over 3? Well, a negative rotation just means that we're rotating in the opposite direction. So here we have positive pi over 6 and positive pi over 3. Well, negative pi over 6 would be the same amount of rotation, just in the opposite direction. So instead of rotating up, negative pi over 6 is going to rotate down. So our x value is radical 3 over 2. And then here's positive pi over 3, so that's how much rotation is there. And then we rotate down, and so negative pi over 3 is the same as positive 5 pi over 3. And so that is what that part would look like. And so here is what our cosine function graph looks like. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have suggestions or problems you want to see worked out, type a comment below. To support the channel, click the Patreon link to help keep this going. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, the best way to understand something is to do it.